All right, so in the creature project, we're going to learn something that is a little bit complicated, and it's called shape keys. And shape keys are a way of animating meshes. And the way shape keys work are not intuitive because they are nothing like something from real life. If you wanted to go to the trouble of adding armatures, and I know some of you have already asked me questions about armatures, you're welcome to do that. But armatures are going to be tackled in the next project. And they're hyper simple armatures that become rigs. And we're not ready quite for that kind of thinking. So what we're going to be doing is working with shape keys, working with constraints, and then working more with materials, and then employing some of the other tools we've already made, assets that we made, such as our cyclorama. And so what I'm going to do first before I do anything is save my project. So let's go to Save As. I'll go to my F drive here, and looks like we get to create a new month folder. So this is October 24 projects. And we will call this sad creature underscore version 1. And so that's why I'm working from scratch. And what I'm going to do first is just cover some principles of shape keys. Has anyone in here ever worked with shape keys? Nope. They're great when you've built a character with a rig. They're really useful, and there's 100 different types of rigs that you can make. But if you've got something that's got organic materials and so forth, and you want like a creature to smile, or you want a creature to express, I find they're really helpful for those kind of emotions. But you can build that with a rig and as well. So a rig is a bone system inside of your mesh that works like our bones, that your mesh is connected to, and if you move the bone, then the mesh moves accordingly. But a shape key is where we take the parts of the mesh that is the polygon, like my hand here, and we manually change their position, and then just record that with keyframes. So to show you what a shape key is, I'm just going to create a simple icosphere, and I'll just give it a few subdivisions here. So that way it looks about like this. And then if we come over to the vertex data, the data of the individual points of this mesh, that's what this little green guy over here is. We see vertex groups and we see shape keys. Right now I'm in object mode, and I'm going to want to stay in object mode to create the basis key. So I hit the little plus there and we have the basis. You got to have a basis, and the basis is just its normal state. You just got to have that before you create anything else. And the order in which you do this is important, because if you don't do it in the right order, nothing works. The order in which you do it is, I want to create the first shape key. So I'm in object mode, and I hit the little plus icon on the shape key, and it's called key 1. And I do that in object mode. While it's selected, I then switch into edit mode, and I select a part of the mesh. Let's use soft select. And I'll just hit G, and I'll move this guy out here like this. Now what you'll see is if I hop back into object mode, it pops back to where it was. And the way the shape key is now made is if I look at this shape key and I have it selected here, we see a value. If I drag that value, you can see it moves the mesh. If I set a keyframe by just tapping here on frame 1, then that keyframe is animated, or at least a keyframe has been made. And if I come over here to say frame 100, and I drag the slider to the 1 value, and then I set another keyframe, then I've made an animation where this thing morphs, essentially. Does that make sense? So you can have as many shape keys as you want, but you can also change the range here. So notice the range is 0 to 1. And that is the exact configuration I had for the different 2 modes. But if I change the max here to 2, it takes whatever I did and it just amplifies it. So if I increase now to 2, it just makes that bigger. So this is really useful if you're making a cartoon-like character and you want it to have extremes in expression and things like that. So he's smiling, then you can change that range and have him really smile, things like that. So if you're looking for cartoonish types of animations, shape keys are really helpful for that purpose. But something that you can also do is you can combine shape keys. So I'll just put my keyframe back at the beginning, and I'll create another shape key, so key 2. And then I'll go into edit mode, and I'll select another point, and I'll hit G, and I'll move that out. Then I'll pop it back into object mode by hitting the tab key. And while I'm at it, do I have screen? Let's go make sure I have screencast keys turned on. Keys. Let's make sure that's installed. Good. So that way you guys will see that. Hopefully you'll see that. Should have set that up before I started. Let's change the location of it. Set origin. I'll come back to that. All right, fine. I believe that's there. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. All right. So now if I drag key 2, and you see the value, you see that orb come out. Now, the interesting thing is I can select key 1, and I can drag that out as well. And so you can see how you can combine the two different keys. So if I have this animation already of the orb growing, I can set a keyframe for this other one. So I can set a keyframe here, and then I can drag, while that other one comes out, I can then drag this one out at the same time. So then if I hit play, you can see I'm combining two shape keys at the same time. And it just coordinates all that appropriately. So shape keys are a way for you to manipulate the mesh over time and have that animated. I'll go through that process one more time so you can see it. So let's create another keyframe, and let's go into edit mode. And I'll edit it a little bit differently this time. Let's just use a different soft select here. Let's use random. And then if I hit G and pull it out, it makes this knobbly sort of shape. And I'll do it all over it. G, pull that out. And G. And you can totally glitch it out if you want to. It'll still work. So now we've got this sort of gross shape. And if I drag the keyframe on that, you can see it goes like this. So as it plays, you can see it's growing, but we can change that range. If we change the minimum here to, say, -5, we can drag the minimum, and you can see how it collapses and does all sorts of weird distortions. And we can make the maximum 5 as well. So that way, let's go ahead and change it to 0 first. And then as it's growing, we can combine all the different keys. If I step into the timeline, I'll see the different keys here that I'm changing over time. So let's set a keyframe here for key 3. And then as it's growing, it can also be distorting. Set another keyframe here. So now as I play it, you can see how all the different keyframes are now combined. So we can use shape keys to animate the face of our characters or animate different parts. And what I'm going to do, just to keep things super simple, is I'm just going to make my character look like it's breathing. Yeah, right.
I just know on one of the previous videos on Blender, you were talking about how doing something like that really messes with the mesh. Like if it holds in or
Yeah, you can really mess up the mesh. And you should avoid doing it too much, unless glitchiness is the way you want it to look. But it's really helpful if you want to make something just have a little bit of more emotion or tweak the way it looks without having to build a whole rig. But it can mess things up. But we're just going to use it in a limited way. And the way we're building textures today is also going to be very limited because we're not really going to use UVs. Because if we use UVs, our textures will sit on our object properly, but here they're not going to. So the other aspect that we'll be looking at here is, let's go ahead and create another, let's make another icosphere for now. Just going to increase this. Let's shade that smooth. Let's go over to the shading tab. And if I haven't loaded the shading tab, I've noticed that on these machines in particular, if I go over to the shading tab, it'll just sit here for a few minutes while it's loading the right objects into the GPU. So it'll look like it's crashing. Just sit there and be patient. I'm still recording, so good. I'm going to wait for the program to respond. Especially, I just installed Blender, so there we go. We're good. Yep.
You use the random tool.
Where did I find that again? You have a few random tools. So if I go into edit mode, let's go back over to layout. If I go into edit mode and I was using soft select, you can normally just use this curve, but you have a random function here. But you also have random over here in your edit tools. So normally you can choose a smooth selection, and then it'll try to like move that selection here. But here you have randomize. So if I select all the mesh and I have randomize selected, I can randomize what it pulls out. And so, yeah, I don't recommend doing that. That makes for a very unhealthy mesh.
That was really cool.
All right, let's look at some shading techniques real quick, just because I want to create some organic kind of creature-like skin and what that might look like and how I might try to create that. So I'm going to create a new material for this orb and just talk about how we can set things up. And right now I'm in the material preview tab, which is this look dev viewport shading. When I'm in that view, it creates this world in the background that is hypothetical for rendering. If I switch to rendered, this is what it's going to render, the gray world. But when I'm in the material preview, I've got this background that I can use as an example lighting situation. If I don't like that, I can click on this down arrow and choose from any of these, or I can upload my own. These are HDRIs, just like we download from Polyhaven, but they ship with Blender. So if you want to see an interior space that's dark, or if you want to see a daylight space that looks like the woods, or a parking lot sort of lighting situation, you can quickly switch to any of those. Yeah, Ezekiel?
Can you use BlenderKit for like materials? If you can't like make a fur, I probably can just use one of the
Off of what?
BlenderKit.
Yeah, you can use it. It's just be aware that you're getting into more sophistication than the project is calling for. And there is a really good blur, not blur, but fur setup that comes with Blender already. All you need to do is, let's come back over to layout. And I was going to talk about this, but I'll just add it in because you had a question. So if we add a curve, notice that there's a fur object right here. So we just add fur to this guy. And so now there's fur on it. And then if you look in your assets panel, I'm just going to split this panel and switch over to the assets panel. You'll see that there comes with this a whole bunch of curve and hair tools that you can use to manipulate this hair and make it look pretty realistic. The only limitation to this system of the hair, because there's two systems of hair in Blender right now, one's going to be going away, is that it doesn't support physics, so it doesn't blow in the wind or anything like that, but you can fake it using simulation nodes, which I think in the next version of Blender will probably be solved. But anyway, we'll talk about that after the fact. Let's switch back now to just manipulating materials. Go back to the shading tab. Right now this is the base color, and so we could by default just say, all right, let's just make our creature green, right? And now we've got a texture, and maybe we want it to look wet, so we'll just turn down the roughness, and then now it's got sort of a shininess. Simple, easy, but we can make it more complicated than that. Normally if it's like a lizard sort of or amphibian type of skin, the skin is translucent. So if we come over to subsurface settings here, we can turn up the weight. And it takes a moment for Eevee to compile, especially on these not super fast computers. And it'll act like it's crashing when you use this for the first time. Just be patient. If you're on a faster machine, it works really well, but it's a little bit taxing.
I wish I knew how to make a body.
Okay.
That's my thought right now.
That's your thought? Like a alien body, a human body.
Cool. Like mixed together.
Okay. After this class, you'll know how to get started. So if I change the weight of this, it doesn't change a whole lot depending on what I'm doing. But if I change the scale here, you'll start to see what's happening. And this allows light to pass through this object a little bit. If I turn up the roughness, you'll start to see it looks a bit more plasticky. If I were to scale it, SX, S2, SY, so that it's very thin, you'll start to see the way light kind of passes through this object. And it has much more of a plastic feel. So you can also see here that the radius values here, this is red, green, and blue, it's optimized so that red is strongest. Subsurface scatter assumes that you're trying to make a humanoid character and that humans have red blood, and so that when the light hits it, it'll do that. But if you're doing some sort of other material like milk, or something like that, then you might change what the subsurface actually looks like. So if I change these different colors here, you can see the light that's inside of this object. Now it's actually more red. And if I change it here, you can see what it's doing to the internal light sort of effects of it. What you can also do is feed other materials into it. And so let's get into some procedural textures. A lot of you like playing with the magic texture before. So if we take the magic texture and we plug the color up to the radius factor here, it'll take a moment to compile, and then you'll start seeing that magic texture only on one side because we're seeing where the light is passing through it. If we change the weight here, you can see how intense that is or not intense that is. If we change the depth, every time we change these, it's got to compile a little bit. And so you can see what that's doing. Now, what I normally do is I don't use magic texture. My favorite texture is the Voronoi texture. It's very useful. And if we plug distance up to radius, now distance is only going to create a color that's black and white. If we want to see what that texture actually looks like, we can plug it up to the base color here, and you'll see what that texture looks like. And you can change the different algorithms, such as smooth F1, and see how they look a little bit different, or F2. And you can see how they function slightly different. Distance to edge. I prefer the default, which is just F1. And this Voronoi texture appears throughout nature. It's like what you see at the bottom of a pool. You see it on lots of skin surfaces, and you can use it to generate a lot of different types of reality sort of factors. If I go to color ramp here, I can tweak that signal so that we make the darker areas sort of brighter. And as I adjust it, you can see what it's doing to that. So this is the color ramp node. It's really useful for sort of tweaking that signal. And what I want you to imagine, these lines going here is a signal going from here to here is between 0 and 1. And we're sort of changing the math so that we're bottoming out the ones that are closer to 0, so that way only 0.5 and above are making it there. But that's not quite the case. And you can also change the value here to see how that affects what's happening. So we can use this signal now to switch between other colors. And notice that it's still, that's on the base color. But if we switch that to the radius color here, we'll see it as it's passing light through it. And we can adjust it as we need to. But what I do is I take the color mixer, I go to add, I'm hitting Shift A by the way, and I choose mix color. I'll plug that in. And now instead of mixing between two grays, we'll mix between, say, a red and a darker green. There we go. And so then what I get is this sort of material color on this. And we can use that as well to mix between the results on the base color. And then what we can do is we can take this color here, Shift D, and I'll just duplicate this node. And I'll use this signal to mix between other colors. So we'll try a lighter green and a bluish color here. And then we'll plug that into the result here. And so what I'm trying to do is just use my shader nodes as a mixing palette. And we can also use this signal to mix the roughness. So if I then take this, let's do it before the color ramp. So I'll take the unmixed signal before the color ramp. And that'll mean we're using it to make some areas shiny and other areas not shiny. And if we want to adjust that, we can just move this sort of mess, spaghetti mess here, and I'll take this and I'll duplicate it and I'll plug it in there. And I'll just tweak that signal, and you can see what that's doing to the shininess of our object. I'll just turn weight up all the way. And then what we'll also do is we'll plug this signal up to the displacement. So plug it up to the displacement. It's going to look like poo at first. But what I'll have to add is Shift A. I'll search for a displacement node. And I'll plug that in before it gets to the displacement input of the material output. And then I'll plug that up into the height. Still looks bad. But here's the cool thing. In Blender 4.2, you have material place displacement and geometry displacement in Eevee. So if I come over here to options, I can say, and this is in the in panel, I can come over here and say, instead of bump only, we can say displacement and bump. And then it takes the material and it actually displaces it physically. And so obviously it's too strong, so we can change it to say 0.01, make it much more subtle, or 0.1, and then we just get like this sort of subtle shape here. And it's too even for me, so I like to add some more naturalness to it. So what I'll do is I'll add a noise texture, so texture and a noise texture, and I'll plug that factor up into something like the scale or the roughness of the Voronoi texture. And I'll see how that manipulates that signal. Give it a second to compile. And then what we get is something that is seemingly more natural, and I can adjust the scale on that. You can see what that's doing. And I can adjust the elements here. And so now I'm starting to get a material that looks not quite like it's CGI, but you start to see what I'm trying to do. So I just play around with this until I get something that I kind of like. And so I just throw in other signals to it and see what I can get. I think these colors are kind of too similar, so I might try to adjust them a little bit more. Let's take the color ramp and plug it in here. See if I can tweak these signals to get more differentiation in the color of our object. If you use the color ramp here, actually what that does is it turns it all to gray because the color ramp can't handle RGB. So we got to put that in before. We should be getting more of a differentiation, but kind of not. There we go. So it's like on parts. Yeah, like that's what I'm sort of looking for, is to see if I can get like a signal that is in just certain segments. And so that way the lower parts are this kind of funky gray, while the upper areas look a little bit different. Does that make sense? You have to sort of play around with this and try to get just the right mix. But when I go into this, I never know exactly what I'm going to get. I play around with it until I get something that looks organic and is sort of playing with the noise in the right way. Haley, your hand is up.
Oh, you just answered the question.
What was the question? Like how do I know what I want?
I was going to ask, how do you know which notes to use to which, and you said by playing around.
I play around with it. And if you remember right, everybody during all the critiques, everyone that says I play around with it until they got something I like, it's exactly what you get. I know in Illustrator and on YouTube, people say, now connect this to this, push this button and this button. But the better way you learn the software is to play with it like a kid playing with finger paint. And you'll be happier doing so. And that's what I want you to do. This is your new finger paint. Now, I like this material for now, and I'm just going to save it out. So let's go to File, Save As. And I'm going in my October projects here. We'll call this project, we'll call it Materials. And I'll hit Save As. And let's call this material Skin. We'll just call it Skin for now. All right. So we've got this material, and the object was just for me to test it out on, right? Let's go back and create another project, General, save that. And let's go ahead and just make a super simple organic shape. And we're going to use some new kinds of objects called meta objects. And I like meta objects because they're great for creating weird, sort of organic looking shapes. So I'm going to delete my cube, and then I'm going to Shift A, and I'm going to go to meta ball. I'm going to add a ball. So the way meta balls work is they're a different kind of object. If you'll notice, there's no modifiers here. You can't add modifiers to them. If I go into edit mode, I can just change the size of it. All right. So what meta balls are just objects you use to manipulate other objects, and or they're basically like mercury. Hopefully you've never played with like liquid mercury before, but here I'll show you. If I take this meta ball and I hit Shift D and I move it around, notice how it reacts to itself. Kind of sticks to itself. And you can add other meta objects as well. So like a meta capsule, if I hit G, it sort of sticks to itself. They're sticky and they're gooey and things like that. They're kind of weird. But they also have metaball settings. That's what this data object is here. Doesn't have vertices, doesn't have edges, kind of doesn't have faces, but it does have a resolution. And it does have an influence. If I change the way this object, they influence each other. Notice I'm changing them for all of them because they work together as a group. They also have a resolution. The lower the number, the more the detail. Normally I change them down to 0.1, and that makes them more solid. Shift D, I can move this around. You can see what I'm doing here is I'm just sculpting out a form, Shift D, and so you can create something that would be hard to model with just edges and cubes and things like that. So you can create like a more realistic molecule if you wanted to. I'm going to go ahead and just start over with all of these guys. I'm just going to delete them. And then let's go ahead and add just a simple metaball. I'm going to change the resolution on both the viewport and the render to 0.1. And then I'm just going to duplicate this a few times to create like a sort of Jabba the Hutt sort of form. So I'm going to hit Shift D and then X. So I'm locking it on the X axis, and I'll make this ball a little bit smaller. And then just move GZ to move it down a little bit. Then I'll select this one again, and Shift D and X, move this out, make this one a little bit bigger, and move it up a little bit. And if you want to look at it from the side, it doesn't really matter that much how realistic it is. I'm just trying to play around with it. And then Shift D again, and let's sort of make a head sort of shape for it. So S, and put this right here. And you can hit SX and scale it out longer if you want to. So now we've got like this sort of slug type of shape, right? And if you'll notice here, if I select the first one that I created, it selects the whole thing. Even though I can move that around separately, they're working as a group. And I can't really do much more with it beyond this and set up the basic shapes. So what I need to do then is convert it into a mesh. And when you convert it into a mesh, it's going to make a very unhealthy topography of quads and tris and so forth, which are very difficult to animate. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go to Object, Convert to a mesh. Now it's a mesh. And if I go into Edit mode, you'll see the polys that it's made out of. It's made out of all these tris as well as quads and so forth. And if you were to try to set an armature to this, you would have a most unpleasant experience indeed. But you could stop here and not go any further in terms of modeling it if you want. I'm going to go a little bit further. What I'm going to do is remesh this. And so under the vertex data for this guy now, we have our shape keys and we have our vertex groups. We also have remesh down here. And we're going to choose a voxel remesh. If I hit voxel remesh right now, what that does is it means it's going to look inside of it and re-topologize, redraw all the mesh around this, trying to do so with quads. So if I hit voxel remesh, you see it change a little bit, but if I go into edit mode, you'll see it's now made out of exclusively quad shapes. And it looks pretty good. It's nice and smooth. Normally a good topography, what you're looking for when I say topography, especially if it's going to be an animated character, is if I go into edit mode, we want a consistent density of polygons. A mesh that'll give you trouble is if you see a whole bunch of polygons that are very small in one area and then bigger ones in other areas. That'll create glitches when you try to animate. But if your topography is consistent throughout, then we call that a healthier mesh. Now, this is not the healthiest of mesh because we have these sort of oblong quads with these other sort of shapes, and that's just because that's how the algorithm works. If we were to do this for a video game or for a movie or something, we would have to go through and carefully make our topography match the movements and muscles and places where our creature are going to go. That goes beyond the scope of this project. And there are add-ons that you can buy that will do that for you pseudo-automatically. But for now, we're just going to do simple objects like this. So now what I want to do is, let's go ahead and just import that material I made in the other Blender project. So if I go to File, Append, and I go to my projects over here, let's go to the F projects, October 24, I have materials. Inside of that Blender project, I can now go to materials, and then I have this skin material that I made earlier. So now I can append it, and then if I go to the shading tab, and also let's make sure we save this. And if we haven't saved it, let's call it Sad Creature 2, because I sort of Sad Creature version 02, because I kind of restarted what I was doing here. Then let's go to the shading tab, and then we'll see that skin material is right there. It's called Zero Skin because it appended it, and we can apply it to our object. Give it a second to contemplate it.
Yeah, that's my habit. When it doesn't work immediately, I assume I did something wrong.
Yep, yep. That's, if you're on a better computer, it happens instantly. But on these computers, they're kind of mediocre. It's going to take a moment. There we go. So now that material is on my object, and it's kind of goofy, but I can adjust it accordingly. So I can change the scale here. If I increase the scale, it might cover it in different areas. I can also change it from scale here to detail. See what that gets me. So that's all right. And I can play with the ramps here to see if I can create other sort of shapes that I want to make. And but again, you can play with it after the fact. You can adjust it after you've made it. It's okay. It's not destructive. All right. So we'll save it for now. And maybe what I want to do is I want to tweak the shape a little bit. So now that we've remeshed it, we can go into sculpting mode. And sculpting mode is not for the faint of heart, so we're just going to tiptoe into sculpting mode. Because I think I don't like these bumps and so forth. I would like to smooth that out. So I'm going to take my smooth tool here, and I'm just going to hit the F key to make my brush a bit bigger, and I'm going to smooth that out. Now, I would like it to be symmetrical, so I'm going to turn on X symmetry. So that way, any change I make on one side should happen on the other side. Now, it's not, because that's not the X axis. If I look here, I want it to be symmetrical on the Y axis. I'm going to switch to the Y axis, not the X axis. Then if we switch over, we'll see it's copying it onto both sides. Right now my strength is this, and my radius is this. So if I increase that, I can smooth it out as I need to. Okay. Now when we're working in this mode of sculpting, the amount of polys that we have doesn't change. It just takes what you have and manipulates it and moves it around. If I turn on Dentopo, that's the ingredient for getting some interesting, more interesting meshes, and you can do a lot of sculpting that way, but it also creates the possibility of creating an unhealthy mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and do this, and those of you that are sleeping, you can just ignore that. So I'm just going to come over here and turn on Dentopo. And when we go into Dentopo, let's step into edit mode first. This is my mesh. But go back into sculpt mode, and let's use a simple tool like the snake hook tool. So let's make my brush a little bit smaller. And if I pull out, say, like, let's pull out a horn on this guy, right? And so pulled it out on both sides. But if I step into edit mode, that looks okay, but you can see we have some wonky mesh right here. And the way Dentopo works, which means dynamic topology, is the closer I get to the thing that I'm trying to sculpt, the more detail it will add. So now if I look at that in edit mode, we'll see it's created a much denser mesh right here. So this is an ingredient for problems. And you want to avoid doing this if you plan to animate that. Yes?
Is the mesh the way that ends up affected by the strength of the brush?
Yes, yes. But the interesting thing about Dentopo is it's mostly affected by your distance from the scene. So if I try to click on it here, it's going to make a more a broader shape. But if I'm really close to it, the density stays the same no matter how far away I am from it. So if I get really close here, I get more detail. But if I back away and go into edit mode, you'll see that it's even denser right there than it is right here. So if you don't plan to animate that, it's a great way and fun way to make some interesting shapes. And when I'm trying to get kids, when I have like, I'm working with high school students and I want them to have fun with Blender, I just jump right into this because then they feel like they have all the power in the world. The problem is when you try to animate this, everything starts to fall apart. But we can leave that like that and make some fun details that way. Yeah.
When you say animate, like it now looks like it was moved, but if we were to move his head to the
Well, it depends on how you want to animate his head to the side. Normally what we would do is we would create a bone system in here, and we would tell this part of the mesh to be connected to one part of that bone. The problem comes with what of the topography here is going to distort. If the mesh over here in the neck is consistent in its topology concentration, and it's not made out of a whole bunch of tries like we see right here, then it will distort in a way that is consistent with the way we expect skin to behave. But if it's not, certain parts will distort faster, certain parts will break apart, and other parts will just glitch out.
For like the details, because of the density of the small section of the horn, would that be affected in the animation of the head?
Not as a whole, no.
Okay.
No. And you can certainly do that. And when we build more advanced characters, in my Motion 2 class, we are going to do an advanced character, then you can have that be a whole separate object, so it becomes a non-issue. And that's what I would recommend. But we're trying to do things in the tiptoe sort of fashion right now. Now, you'll notice that in sculpt mode, there is a remesh function here. And that remesh works exactly like it does down here. It's basically a repeated algorithm. And so the remesh function is built into the sculpt mode because it knows if you're using Dentopo or anything, you're going to mess up your mesh and you're going to have to remesh it again. So I'm just going to go ahead and try to remesh this. And you have to do it, you should have to do it in object mode, but all right, we'll do it down here. Voxel remesh, and what you'll see is the voxel remesh took away a lot of that detail. And if I go into edit mode now, you'll see it did it because it's trying to keep a consistent topology across the whole thing. And it's also made some wonky sort of shapes right here, which are not going to look very good if they're rendered. So the way we can work around that is to retopologize in more detail. And we do that by changing the voxel size to a smaller number. So that way the voxels are the interior sort of data boxes that it's made out of. We'll just change this to 0.05. If you make this too small and you hit voxel remesh, it'll crash because it's going to make too many polys. So always hit save before you do this, and I'll hit voxel remesh again, and you can see what that's doing. It's added more detail, but might want to go back to the previous state where I had these kind of horns, and I'll do 0.05 and try to voxel remesh that. Now I get this kind of shape. For the most part, I'm not going to try to fight this very much. What I am going to try to do, though, is go back into sculpt mode, and I'm not going to turn on Dentopo. I am going to turn on bulge here, this bulge tool, inflate, and with the Y symmetry selected, if I use this, it's going to make like eyes, right? But I want actually the inverse of that. So I'm going to hit minus instead of plus. Now, if you have like a Wacom tablet, it's really fun to use the sculpting tools because you can activate pressure sensitivity with Wacom tablets, and you can really get to the haptic sort of feel. So you can use that Wacom tablet over there, and I see a lot of students, they really get into this. And some people, this becomes their whole world, and they get into sculpting, and you can watch videos on YouTube and see people make amazing stuff with these tools. Yes?
Do you just mirror the screen on your computer?
You can do that, yeah, or you can extend the screen. Either way works. And so I'm going to build some quick eye sockets into my guy right here. So I'm just bulging it in a little bit. I'm trying to keep it really simple, so that way I just have a place to put some eyes. Big, goofy eyes like that, yeah. And then if you want a mouth on this guy, we're not going to animate his mouth or anything. We might animate his mouth with shape keys, but we're just going to animate, draw a mouth. And I'm not in Dentopo mode. There's a crease tool right here. So we can just take the crease tool and notice that it's trying to follow the symmetry, and we'll just, that's going to be too big, so I'm going to make my brush smaller. And just put in a little mouth on it. Kind of like starting to look like a little oxycodal kind of guy, right? All right, now let's step back into our layout. So we have this shape, and if we go back into our shading, we'll see we got this kind of material on him, which is looking all right. What I might do is make sure I shade smooth, and the crevices that I'm seeing are from the Voronoi texture, so I might have to adjust that, or I might just keep it. All right. Now, one of the things I might want to bring in now is some proper lighting. I want to see how this thing's going to look in a render. So I'm going to append my cyclorama that I made in a previous project last month. So if I go over here to September 24 projects and I go to the box project we did last week, there's my cyclorama. I'll bring in that collection, and then there's the cyc, complete with all my lights and everything, so I don't have to recreate them again. I'll append it, there it is. Now, if you really want to make this kind of interesting, what we can do is you can save these kind of assets that you build as literal assets. So if I come over to the asset browser, let's close this part of it. It comes default with all these hair assets, which are basically geometry node setups. But I can right click on a collection, I can right click on anything I'm using and say, hey, mark this as an asset. And now in my collection, I'll see that this cyclorama is available for me to use and use over and over again. I can, in fact, delete it over here. Let's delete everything inside of it. If you delete the collection, the objects just come back, but I'll just delete everything in here, delete it here. Oh no, it does delete it from that. Okay, never mind. But drag that in. Okay, I am a liar and I haven't learned how assets work yet. Okay, so I think they have to exist as external assets for that to happen. Now you can see I made my object really big, so I'm just going to scale it down and you'll see nothing happen. Okay, good. Let's move in a little bit closer. And now we're seeing this, but we're still seeing it from the material preview. Let's go back to render. So now here's what my render is going to start to look like. Let's scale this guy GZ. Let's move it up a little bit so he's sort of on the ground. We'll have him go through the cyclorama so that way it kind of looks like a slug sort of shape. And then let's turn him a little bit. So RZ, whoa, too much. RZ, so he's about right here. Okay. Now, let's go back over to shading. And let's set my camera up at a specific angle.
How'd you just do that?
Do what?
How'd you move it without using like hand, like
Move what?
move your view, the camera view?
I haven't moved my camera view. I'm using the middle mouse button to move things around.
No, I meant like,
I was in the layout view and I switched to the shading tab.
no, I know.
Do this shit and then everyone else figured it out one day.
Never mind.
Thanks, Amaya. All right, I'm just going to set up a quick camera view. Let's go with like maybe from this angle right here. So let's go to view, align active camera to view. So now this is what my camera sees. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to switch my main renderer to cycles and make sure that's set to the GPU. Now if I look at it through the renderer, we'll see what Cycles sees. And what you'll see is that Cycles likes, subsurface scattering a lot more. So my dude now looks a lot more translucent, his spots are more spotty, and we got something. All right. And this is what he's looking like in this side. We might want to adjust his subsurface scattering so that the scale isn't nearly as high. Maybe change that down to 1, maybe 2. There we go. You start to see what we got here for my creature. But he needs eyes, don't you think? And I'm not going to give him lizard eyes. I'm going to give him human eyes because that'll be weird. I like weird. All right. So let's hit save. And let's switch to solid shading. Now, so this is my dude here. So let's just call him dude. And let's put him in his own collection. So let's create another collection over here. That's layers, collection. We'll call this my character. And let's move him in there. And instead of calling him dude, if you wanted to call him body, that might be a little bit more professional. And so I like to move my my set. We'll call this my set. And so my cameras, and I don't need this light. So my camera's here, and my cyclorama is on the set. So now I have all of that. The reason I set all this up and keep it organized is so that I can quickly turn it all off when I want to do something else, right? And so let's go ahead and create an eye. So I'm going to create a mesh. I'm going to create a UV sphere. And let's render this in flat shading. And when I add this sphere, I'm going to increase the segments on it to 64 and the rings to 32. So that way I've got a little bit more detail in the eye. And then I'll shade smooth it. Let's get rid of the asset browser. We don't need that right now. Now, this does not make an eye. let's go ahead and switch to shading tab. And let's look at this through the material preview. Let's give this a new material. We'll call this eye whites. Let's make his eyes red. I think that, no, what color should the whites of his eyes be, guys? Let's make them yellow. Yellow eyes. So we're going to go ahead and make the eyes a little bit yellow. And because eyes are shiny, we'll turn down roughness almost all the way. So that way the eye will be shiny. But he needs a pupil. Don't you agree?
Yeah.
All right. And because I made a UV sphere, it's super easy to give it a pupil. So let's go into edit mode, tab. And what we're going to do is we're going to select some of the circles up here. Characters with tiny eyes tend to be meaner. Characters with bigger, tinier pupils are read as angry, because when people get angry, their pupils get small. But when people are friendly or are in love with you, their pupils open up because they feel safe. And so people read that subconsciously in their artwork. So we'll give him really big pupils. So we'll select face select here, and then I'll use, just click off of it and use circle select, C, to select a bunch of these circles on the inside here. So that will be his pupil. And so let's hit escape to get out of circle select. And then I'm going to come over to slots, create a new slot, and then a new material for slot 2. And that material will be called pupil. And then under the slot tab here, we'll assign it to those faces that are currently selected. Assign. Now it's white, so we'll just make it black. And then we'll turn down roughness as well, so it's nice and shiny. So now that's how we make a quick and easy eye, right? And we'll name this guy Eye, because that's what he is. Now we'll turn our character and our object back on. Obviously my eye is too big, so let's scale it down. Scale it down. Let's zoom in, and let's align that eye onto the body. So let's move it over, and let's rotate it. I need it to be rotating further down, so RY rather, 90. There we are. And let's just move it over and then just manually place it where we think his eye should go. G. And then if I hit RR repeatedly, just RR twice, I can adjust it as I need to. S. Just get it into his eye socket. If you need to use the control tools or switch to layout mode and then zoom in, that's perfectly okay too.
That's what I do.
Yeah, if you like to use the control widgets, that's entirely up to you.
It takes so much longer.
For me, I find life is a lot easier when I'm just hitting G, hitting R, and just adjusting everything accordingly. Okay. All right, let's duplicate this. Notice that it's not quite in the direction I want, so I'll change the widget tool here to be local, and my widgets will be a little bit different, but I've moved everything around off the x-axis. So normally you would want to set this up before you've moved it off of the x-axis. It would be a little bit easier. But I'll just hit Shift D and then move it over so I have the other eye on this side. Now he's got a soul, okay, and he's coming to life. Now you can adjust this however you want. If you wanted to make the eyes a little bit bigger, S, whatever you need to do. Now the eyes are not in the character yet, so let's put them in the character collection in case we need to turn that off or make adjustments. Now, adjusting the eyes so that they're doing stuff in the animation is tricky, and here's the way I'm going to do that. I'm going to use something called a constraint. A constraint means don't do this or copy something else. So we're going to make the eyes always looking at something, and that thing that we're always going to be looking at is an empty. So the 3D cursor is right here in the center of the stage. We'll move that 3D cursor, if I use the 3D cursor tool, somewhere out here. Somewhere where our character would be looking. And I'm going to create an empty there. So I'm going to go to Add, Empty, Plane Axes. So we've created a plane axis empty. This is going to be called Look. And I'll put it in the character because it's part of the character's rig, so to speak. And now we want these eyes to always be looking at, and notice that my 3D cursor went over here because my 3D cursor tool is the thing that's selected. Move it over here, and then use my selection tool. Select an eye, and we're going to put a constraint on that. It'd be good to name these eyes properly. Right eye, left eye. Actually, that would be his right eye, so this is his left eye. right eye. Good? All right, and this camera keeps getting in my way, so I'm going to select it and hide it for now. All right, so we want these eyes to always be looking at that empty. And so to do that, we're going to use a constraint. So with one eye selected, I choose this tool right here, which is constraints. And we can add a constraint. And the thing we want it to do is track to an object. The thing we want it to track to, notice the target, is the empty. So we look for the empty in this selection here. Well, we call it look. So we're going to select look. Now, when we do that, it doesn't know what axis we want it to follow on. So when we select it, we'll see the eye point away from it. So we need to change the track axis to Z. Then I'll do the same thing to the other one. Select that eye, add a constraint, track to, and then the object will be look, and then the track axis will be Z. Now what this does then is that whenever I move that empty, G, his eyes are going to be following it. All right, and so likewise, when it gets really close to his eyes, they'll become cross-eyed, or when it's further away, be further away. Now, when we move our eyes, they move quick, right? So we need to set up a simple animation to test that out to see if he's going to be looking around. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to hit file, save incremental. So I've got an extra version to save this guy out as. Now, I'm going to just set a few simple keyframes for the eyes. So we'll just say, all right, let's have him start looking over here. I've set a keyframe for that. If we look at the positions, we see keyframes there. So he'll look over there and maybe just look a little bit further away. So I'll say G, move a little bit there, I. Then he'll sit there for a couple seconds, and then G, he'll look over here, I, and then maybe his eye will adjust a few frames later to a slightly lower view, I, and then let's have him look somewhat closer towards the camera over here, I, and then maybe make a slight adjustment after that, I. Now if I play this back and we look at him, his eye is going to be wandering. And that's okay. But if we want it to look like eyes moving around, we can change the interpolation on these keyframes. You can change interpolation by simply right-clicking them after they're all selected and choose interpolation mode. And you have all these different modes. You have linear, constant, and Bezier. By default, it's chosen Bezier. And we can see that in the curves editor. So by default, we've all been doing any animations in this simple keyframe mode. But we also have a graph editor. And if I select the graph editor, and you're in a coffee shop, you can tell people you're working for NASA, these are my curves. And you can see how they're speeding up and slowing down based on this graph. And if you can't see the graph properly, I can select all the keyframes, and then I can go to View, and let's choose Frame Selected. And then we see the changes over time in a scaled sort of way. We can see how different they are. And so now as we play it, we'll see the movements speeding up, slowing down across time. But I don't want them to move at all. I want them to either jump to those different points. So we'll just change the interpolation mode. And we can do that here, or we can do that in the other timeline. But I'm going to say key, interpolation mode, constant. And I wanted to show this to you in the graph editor because what it does is it just, at each keyframe, it just jumps to those new positions. So then if we look at his eyes with this type of animation, they're just jumping there. Kind of like our eyes. So that's a simple way of taking both eyes and making them move in different directions. And this is the nature of all rigs, where we use one object to control the movement of other objects, and we do it in a more efficient method. Tyler?
Is there a way to like make it so it does this, but it kind of keys them to like turn a little bit so it doesn't instantly change from one direction to the other? It looks like it's just like stop motion almost, where like they move the eye.
Yeah, you can change these so that like if one of these, you don't want them to be, like we'll set these keyframes here, we can set those to a different interpolation mode like Bezier, and then it'll just move a little bit and then jump. So you can tweak it however you want. It doesn't have to be for all of them. And then you can, after they're Bezier, then you can go in here and you have complete control over these curves and how they move, and that's all up to you. You have complete control over all of this. In fact, if you want him to seem really nervous, this is really fun. You can set all of these here and just select all of them. Let's go to modifiers. You can add curve modifiers. And if this is something I use on cameras all the time. I'll add a noise modifier. And what the noise modifier is like really strong at first. So then if I look at it, his eyes are like shifty and really crazy. But we can change the scale of that, and we can change the strength of it so it's a lot lower. And they put it on everything. So let's yeah, we don't want that on everything. Let's undo all of that. Let's just do it on rotation. So if we add a modifier on the Z rotation, just a noise modifier, and then change the scale so it's wide, and then the strength to 0.5, so something really subtle, then his eyes will just sort of be, oh, you know what? It's an empty, so it doesn't really matter if what its rotation is. I'm used to doing that. Let's do it for Z rotation. Add a modifier, noise, there we go. So now we see the shakiness, and if we increase the scale, it'll be slower, and then you can add a whole bunch of other motion to it if you need to, or just delete the modifier. Simple rig. All right, so we've got that set up, and our camera looks like this, and if we were to play it, we'd see his eyes moving around. Good. But he still doesn't quite feel very alive, and also if he turned his head at all, or if he did any movements, the eyes would get lost. And so, for example, if I hit G, oh no, we don't want that to happen, right? And so what I'm going to do now is set another constraint. And I'm a little out of practice with this, so it might take a little bit of work, but let's go for it. Let's hide the eyes for the time being. And what I'm going to do is create new vertex groups, so that way we have constraints for the eyes. And this is one way of doing it. You can do this 100 other ways. But let's switch to flat shading. And let's switch to vertex select. I'm going to select this one right here. And I'm going to create a vertex group. So I'm going to go to the data, and notice there's no vertex groups yet. So I'm just going to create a new vertex group with that one selected. I'll call it right eye, and then I'll assign it. If I hit A to deselect, double A to deselect everything, I can make sure that that is in fact selected by hitting select, and I'll see it's reselected. So I'm going to create another vertex group with this one over here. What do you think I'll call it? Well done. So I'll hit select, assign, and now that vertex group is assigned for that one. I'll hit deselect, and then if I hit select again, we should just see that one. And then if I select the right eye and hit select, it selects that one. So we can use these vertex groups and in combination with constraints to tie other objects to that area of the mesh. So that way we can make the eyes stay on the mesh. So let's go ahead and set that up. So let's turn our eyes back on. Now this will break them a little bit, and we'll have to make some adjustments after the fact. So now we have that eye selected, and it's already got one constraint right here, track 2, but we can also use it to make it the child of. I can't remember exactly which constraint it is. There's several that do something very similar, copy location and so forth. I'm going to try child of, and the child of the object is going to be our body, and then the vertex group of this one is going to be right eye. Now you'll see it go away, and that's okay. What we're going to do is we're going to hit set inverse, and then it comes back. Scientists have been trying to study for years what that set inverse means, and no one knows. But when it goes away, hit set inverse, and it'll come back. And if I move the body, you'll see the eye stays there. But it's its own separate object, meaning the animation and everything can be independent, but if this guy's head gets bigger or anything changes, it's going to stay there, which is really useful when we're building complex rigs. So that process again for this guy, he's already got the track 2 constraint, but we're going to make him child of, and he's a child of the body, and then the vertex group we're locking it to is the left eye, and then set inverse, and now it's back. The reason this is helpful is if I select the whole face or the whole area of the body right here and I turn it, so for example, let's select the body and I go into edit mode, and let's turn on X-ray, and I select everything about right here, but with soft select turned on, so that way it doesn't turn the whole thing. And I hit RZ. Notice, let's make my thing a little smaller. I can turn it, and notice what it's also doing to the mesh. This is why we're not going to do it this way, but the eyes will turn with it because they're locked to it. So that's really quite helpful, especially if we wanted our creature to crawl or slither or anything like that. The most what we're going to do is just have the body do little undulations, like it's like alive, like a slug. And this is how we're going to set that up. We're going to use that same shape key method, but before I make any critical changes, I save incremental. I'm going to switch this back to just keyframes, or timeline rather. There we go. And let's just make a really simple animation. Let's first have his like torso, abdomen, thorax, whatever you want to call it, do a simple breathing animation. So we're going to select a side of it here. Let's turn off X-ray, and let's select this part of the mesh, and let's make sure no other part of the mesh is selected by hitting AA. So now we know nothing is selected. I'll select this part of the mesh, and then shift select this part of the mesh. And then I've got soft select selected, and if I hit S and just make it grow, you can see, all right, that's sort of the look we're going for. And now keep in mind, the way we set up this material is not good for professional animations, because if I move this material too much, let me turn off overlays. If I move this guy too much, G, you'll see that the material gets all distorted. And so if we were to animate this character like to do like running or anything like that, we would have to UV unwrap it and properly build it. But with an organic shape like this, UV unwrapping gets way too complicated. So we're just using what's called basic object-based materials. Okay, back to what we were doing. Let's turn our overlays back on. Let's switch back to object mode, go to shape keys, create our first basis, and then create this new one. And we'll call this one breathing. So then we step into edit mode, and we hit S for scale, and we just make it a little bit bigger. And then we stop back into object mode. That's all I did. So then if I hit the value here, you can see we can just run this back and forth, and he's breathing. So all I'm going to do is set some keyframes. Set a keyframe here, and then come over to frame 40. We breathe about once a second or so. Maybe frame 24, 27, grab this, make it bigger. So then if I play it, so all we need to do then is just Shift D, these two keyframes, Shift D, and Shift D, Shift D, Shift D, Shift D. So now we've made a simple breathing animation. You can also use modifiers on that and create a cycle if you want. And you can adjust that cycle so you don't have to copy keyframes. And so you can automate that process if you want. And then it would happen forever. And that's perfectly okay. If we look at the curves for that, we see that's the curve for it. So if we wanted to adjust the curves so that his breathing was softer, we can just make these curves wider and adjust it accordingly. But I'm not going to bother. So we've got a simple breathing animation. And then we'll just add a few other types of undulations, like maybe make his horns tweak or something. And so we'll do that again with shape keys. Let's come back over to the timeline. Interface is very small here. Go back to the first keyframe, create another one. We'll call this right horn. And then we'll go into edit mode. We'll select this horn right here. I've got soft select selected, and I'll just hit G, roll my mouse to get it the right size, and then I'll just move it a little bit. Now, I've still got Y selected here in edit mode, so it's trying to mirror everything, so I'm going to turn that off, and we'll just have that ear do it. So G, and we'll just move that ear up, and we can also rotate it. Let's get that guy around. R, and then G. So just make a slight adjustment like that. And then if we hop back into object mode, it'll jump back to where it was. So now if we adjust the right horn, You can see it's making a little slight adjustment. And so we can just make that happen occasionally. Let's open up our timeline keyframes here. We have a value for breathing, but we haven't set any keyframes for the right horn. So we'll set a value here, and then we'll set another value. Let's make it happen quick. Here, and then we'll take it back to where it started here. Set another keyframe. So when you see an orange line between the keyframes, that means nothing is changing, because when I was on this keyframe, I didn't actually turn the value all the way up. So there we go. And then turn it off, turn it back on. So orange lines mean nothing is happening, so keep that in mind. So now if we play it, you see it moving around. I would like it to be a little bit faster, so I'll move them closer together. There we go. So it's not much, but you see I'm just making simple adjustments. Let's add another shape key, and let's call it face. All right. And so we have the face selected right here, and we can just have like maybe his face undulates a little bit. So we'll go into edit mode, select this object right here randomly, and we'll just move that around. So soft select is still selected. If I hit G, you can see the eye making a slight adjustment because of the constraint we've tied to it. And then we'll just call it face, and just act like something's bothering him. So we'll set a keyframe here, eye. And one way that I like to do it is I like to set the beginning and end first. So the beginning and end are going to be right here, and then we'll go to the middle between those two, and then just turn that value up. Maybe not all the way, and set a keyframe there. So now you can see we've just made like a slight adjustment. And if you've ever had babies, you know their faces do this anyway. So already he's looking pretty nervous. So let's make him smile. So if I go into edit mode, or first let's create a shape key called smile. And let's go into flat shading so we can see that smile a little bit better. Let's go into edit mode, and let's turn on Y symmetry again. You know what, I won't, let's just not. And then let's select this keyframe, and then this not keyframe, but vertex. And we'll just tweak it. Soft select is turned on. I'll hit G, I'll make this a lot smaller, and we'll just try to adjust it so that he smiles a little bit. If it helps, adjust your angle of attack. So if I'm looking at it from this angle, or just do one side at a time, that's perfectly okay too. So if I move this side over, maybe rotate it a bit too, G. And crooked smiles are nice, so G, maybe make this a lot smaller, and then, whoa, rotate it, G, and then step back, and then if I drag the value here, hey, I like the way this side looks better, so let's go ahead and adjust it. So if I go back into edit mode, while that key is selected, I can adjust it after the fact. So then let's take one of these vertices again, and let's just pull that up a little bit higher. And something that happens when we smile is our cheekbones go up too. So maybe we want his cheekbones to go up a little bit. So G, move that cheekbone up, and move this cheekbone up, G. All right, so now he's a happy oxycodal sort of creature. Step back into object mode, and if we drag the value, okay, so then we just set keyframes for that. So he gets a little bit nervous. Let's look at it through here. Gets a little bit nervous. Then he sees you, and he smiles. Set a keyframe here, and let's move down just a few frames, and then drag that value up. Set a keyframe there. All right. There we go. I think it happens a little too fast, so I'll slow it down. There we go. And so now he's kind of happy. So let's see what the camera sees. Here's what our camera sees. So the camera needs to get into his angle. So he doesn't see us at first. So we'll set the camera to be about, where's my camera? Let's turn that on. So we'll set my camera to be right here when the movie starts. So we'll set keyframes for it this way. This is its location, and this is its rotation. And then when we get to be about right here, we want to be we want him to be looking directly into the camera. So I'm just going to use the WASD keys to sort of line myself up into his point of view. Yeah. It's kind of hard to get it to move. If you're having trouble getting it to move, I'll left click to confirm, and then I'll hit G for just move. And I'll just try to line it up with the looking view right there, okay? And then let's just tilt the camera down a little bit. And I. So real simple move for the camera. He smiles, he's still breathing. And if you wanted to adjust his head so his head tilts or something like that, you could try doing all of that. I would be very cautious about that though, using shape keys. Moving into more complex animations, we would have to use armatures, and that's for the next project. All right, now let's set up the camera so it renders a little better. Let's go to File Save, and then File Save Incremental. So now I'm on version 5 of what we were doing. Let's turn on depth of field, because this guy's very small. So under depth of field, let's turn that on. And so you can see right away things are blurry. Let's turn down the f-stop so it gets even blurrier. And then let's change the focal distance. And instead of choosing a distance and manually focusing it, I want his eyes, specifically his right eye, to always be in focus. So I'm just going to make that object, right eye, the thing I'm always focusing on. And then I'll change that f-stop to like 0.5. So that way, wherever the camera moves, his face will be in focus for us. All right? And then I think I would like the camera to have a little bit of randomness to it. So we have cameras, a keyframe set for the rotation. So let's select our curve editor, and let's choose one of our rotation curves here. Let's go to modifier, add a noise modifier, and right away it's going to look kind of, no. So let's change that. And if you can't see the curve that it's doing, I'll just hit the period key so that it zooms in. That's the curve that we got going on there. And I'll just scale that way out and make the strength only like 0.1. So it's a real subtle shake. There we go. Let's scale it out more, make that 0.05. So it's really simple. I just want it to look handheld. And so what I'm going to do from here is I like this movement. Let's change it to be a little bit smaller. I'll copy it. That's what this up clipboard means. So I'm going to copy that modifier, select the Y ruler, paste it, but I want it to be off phase a little bit, so it's not bouncing exactly like the Z axis or X axis. So I'll just change the phase. So now if I play it, you'll see it's like a little bit more handheld. Good. And I'll do that for the Z axis as well. Paste that in, change the phase, and then play it. All right, now we got like a bouncy camera, and while he's smiling at us, the camera will be nice and shaking, and then he's lost interest in us and moved on. So I'll hit save, and now I'll adjust the lights, because I'm almost ready to render, but we can make things look a little bit better. Oh, and I also want to adjust the compositing. So let's change this timeline here to the compositor. And I'm going to use nodes. Let's close this in panel, use nodes. And so we can do things like we can add a little bit of glare to our scene. And in order to see it through the viewport, we come over to our render port here. And that's what it's going to look like in cycles, which is looking really good. Let's change this so that we're seeing the compositor in the camera as well. Notice that the depth of field is really strong here in cycles. So we might want to change the f-stop on our camera to like 1 or something to make it a bit more subtle. Good. Now, let's add filter and glare here. I'm hitting Shift A to add this, and I'll make that a fog glow. And I'll change the threshold to like 0.5. And so that adds a nice little sort of scenic glare to the scene, and turn up the quality of it. That might be too much. Let's say 0.8. And so that makes the scene a little bit more interesting. And I can play around with the lights too. I've got my area lights. If I turn one off, you can see what that does to my brightness and contrast. If I change this one, kind of like that one better. But I also might want to add more contrast to the scene as a whole. So I'm going to go to my render settings here and go to the color management. And I'm going to change the look from no contrast to maybe high contrast, maybe very high contrast. And so now it's got a lot more pop to it. And there we go. And then one thing I like to add to my renders to finish things off, I'll hit save. I'm going to add a transform and a lens distortion. I'll plug the lens distortion after the glare, and I'll turn up the turn on projector, and then turn up dispersion. If you want to turn up distortion, you can too, but I don't recommend it. So what the dispersion is doing is it adds a little bit of chromatic aberration to what I'm doing. And if I turn that up a little bit higher, am I looking through the camera? Yeah. You will see it. So basically it adds this imperfection in the lens that makes it look like you're looking through a camera. So I would keep that subtle, like at 0.2. There we go. Let's see how my happy guy looks in a render. I'm going to change my render settings because by default, Cycle's renders are at 4096. We can lower that bad boy to 256. Change the noise threshold to 0.05. Turn off denoise, and then this is really important. I like the noise pattern to change for every frame. So that way, the noise that does still render will look like film grain. But it'll look the same if we don't turn this on. So I go to Advanced, and I turn on the clock on the seed of the noise pattern here. So this is under the render settings, advanced, seed. And what that does is it makes this noise change with every frame. Otherwise it looks like we're looking through the render through like a sandy port, and it doesn't look quite right. All right, and it looks like he's got a little crease in his mouth there. All right, so let's see how long one of these renders will take for one frame. So let's go to render. I like to switch this to solid. I always hit save and render image. And so by default, it's rendering it at 1920 by 1080. And you see his smile there. You see you might want to adjust the lights on the cyclorama because they're pretty bright. So it's rendering frame 38, or not frame, but sample 48, and it usually will speed up a little bit once it gets closer to its finish. There we go. So it's a little noisy, and that took 26 seconds. So I think it's too noisy for what I want. So I'm going to hit escape and close this render port. And let's lower that sample, because when you turn on subsurface, it does make it a little bit noisier. Let's lower that sampling threshold back down to 0.01. And what that noise threshold means is it's going to stop rendering when it reaches a certain level of noise in the render. F12 is the shortcut to render. What does what?
For samples, what does that mean, like,
It's basically sending photons into the scene. The more photons, the more, it's not really photons, but it's rays. The more photons that you move through the scene, the more it scans the scene. And so the more fidelity you get in your render. So right now it's at 96 and 104. And again, this is with the GPU. If you do this with the CPU, it'll be about 5 to 10 times slower. But it's almost done.
We should give him a name.
What's his name? What? Rando? Rando? Okay, you can call him Rando. I like it. Okay, so this is almost done for that frame. And you can still see it's a little bit noisy, but when it renders out with that advanced clock turned on, it'll just look like film grain, and that'll look pretty good. And I think that works out really, really well. So it's almost done. There we go. That's the finish. That's the render. Now, you can render this out, and each frame is taking about a minute and a half. So if I'm rendering 250 frames, how long will that take on this computer? It'll take about 3 to 4 hours to finish the animation. So we can do that there, or we could do it on Sheepit. So if I wanted to render this on Sheepit, I've saved it. I'm not using any external images, so I don't have to pack those images in. Let's come over to Chrome. Let's go to Sheepit. Yeah, I know. That project is not there. And then let's go, if you're logged in, go to Get Started. Choose my file. It's on my F drive. October 24, So here's the sad creature, but sad creature 5, that's the one that I just finished. And so it's 6 megabytes. I hit open, I hit send this file. I'm going to generate an MP4, and I'm going to use the GPU, not the CPU. It's going to render an animation starting from frame 1 to frame 250, add this blend. It should be done within 2 hours, and then I can download it from Sheepit. And that will, and I can walk away. I don't have to use these computers. But keep in mind, when you guys use Sheepit, only 2 projects can render at a time. So if you're trying to wait till the last day, it will not work. Or you can create your own Sheepit account and start building points. And then you can render whenever you want, and that works really well too. What are your questions in the 10 minutes that we have left? I know it was a lot. It does get harder. But, oh, it didn't record. I'm kidding, it recorded. All right, so, all right, I'll upload this to Brightspace momentarily.